May 19th, in the year 1841, at the ordination of Mr. Charles C. Shackford, the great American preacher Theodore Parker delivered the ordination sermon in the Hawes Place Church in downtown Boston, Massachusetts. Still the hub of the universe, and if you don't believe me, ask any New England Patriots fan. Being a native of Boston, I know a lot of them, and they all still think it's the hub of the universe. Theodore Parker was considered the great American preacher by many, and indeed that is what's on his headstone, the great American preacher. Parker had a significant influence on the culture and politics of this country in 1841, when the Transcendentalist movement and the period known as the American Renaissance was first emerging. Theodore Parker is credited with coining a definition of democracy known as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. And Abraham Lincoln would use this definition in his Gettysburg Address when he proclaimed that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. My primary theme this morning is that institutions shape people and people shape institutions. The people that I have come to know and love through my Unitarian Universalist connections the past 26 years have had an enormous influence in altering my worldview. My view of the world, begun by growing up in the 1960s and 1970s Boston, has also been dramatically reshaped and altered by the institution of Unitarian Universalism. Ironically, a religion born in Boston, but one I had never paid attention to until I moved to Seattle. The Boston environment that I grew up in was pretty racist, sexist, and homophobic. That's what I learned. I have vivid memories of white mothers blocking the buses full of black kids to the entrance of South Boston High School as the Southie moms protested the court-ordered desegregation busing policies in the city of Boston in the mid-1970s. Another image seared in my mind is that of a young white man holding a young black man, twisting his arm behind his back on the steps of City Hall and Government Center. Charging at the black man was another white man about to stab him with a spear. It wasn't actually a spear, it was an American flag on a long pole being used as a spear. The date was April 5th, 1976. I was in the 11th grade. 135 years after Theodore Parker delivered his controversial sermon at the ordination of Charles Shackford. Parker's ordination sermon was about the Christian religion and about sources of authority, religious and political. But Parker would become better known for his stance on racism and slavery. And our institutions and people are still struggling mightily with racism and white supremacy. Theodore Parker was perhaps the most influential minister that shaped the institution of American Unitarianism, which took shape as the American Unitarian Association in 1825 and would evolve into today's Unitarian Universalist Association. He was truly one of the great American preachers and one of my personal heroes. Parker was the leader, along with Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, of the Transcendentalist movement, and a major anti-slavery leader and theorist of democracy. His example inspired generations of radical activists. The church institution he helped forge shaped thousands of lives during his lifetime. One of Parker's great passions was his work toward the abolition of slavery. He was politically active in opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and at times he and his wife kept escaped slaves in their home to protect them from roving gangs of slave hunters. Yes, slave hunters were active even in Boston. Slavery's reach seemed to have no bounds. Much like the racism and the not-so-subtle signs of white supremacy we see in our own culture today, and that is creating a lot of strife in UUA and some of our churches. In 1854, the Reverend Theodore Parker was indicted for obstructing justice. He was harboring fugitive slaves, and the charges were eventually dropped, but the stand that he had taken took a toll on his standing in the community and in the Unitarian Association. Parker continued to write sermons about justice and freedom and compassion for humanity, but he did it with a loaded pistol, resting beside the manuscript on his desk, and even, rumor has it, with a pistol in his pulpit on Sunday mornings. On the aforementioned date of May 19, 1841, Parker delivered the ordination sermon for Mr. Shackford, entitled it A Discourse on the Transient and Permanent in Christianity. I would encourage you all to read it, and I would read it here, but it's about 40 pages long. It takes about 2 hours. I don't know how people sat through those things back in those days. Parker was a highly regarded intellectual, and when in his sermon he made a vehement denial of the factuality of miracles in the Bible and denied the miraculous authority of both the Bible and Jesus, his audience took notice, and many became alarmed at this brazen heretic. He was only 31 years of age and was demanding the use of reason when reading the Bible or any religious scripture, and questioned every source of authority he came across. He would not stand for a religious or behavioral orthodoxy handed down to him from history that he could not make sense of. Religion, in his thinking, had to make sense. The miracles of Jesus described in the Bible did not make any sense to him, but he did believe in the teachings of Jesus. He challenged the ministers and the students present at the ordination with a statement that it is hard to see why the great truths of Christianity rest on the personal authority of Jesus, any more than the truths and lessons of geometry rest on the personal authority of Archimedes or any mathematician. Many of the more senior ministers present at the ordination were outraged at this challenge to the authority of the Bible and of Jesus. They published an attack on Parker in the newspapers and demanded to know if Unitarians and the Unitarian Association considered Parker a Christian minister. During the resulting uproar, many Unitarian ministers and a large portion of the Unitarian lay public concluded that Parker's theology was not Christian, and Parker was denied access to other Unitarian church pulpits. He was refused publication of any further writings in the Christian Register, the leading Unitarian publication of that time, that today is known as the UU World Magazine. Parker feared his ministerial career was over. The controversy did in fact cost him many Unitarian friendships and forced him to abandon his early dream of becoming accepted as a member of the Boston elite. Even his wife's family, he later wrote, treated him as if he had committed a crime. Clearly, if you were a Unitarian minister in the year 1841, without a Facebook or a Twitter account, and you really wanted to deliver a controversial message that would be sure to upset a good portion of the congregation, and indeed the entire denomination, the best way to upset everyone was to deliver the sermon at the ordination of a seminary student who had recently graduated from Harvard Divinity School. The ordinations of new ministers meant that all the other ministers from the Unitarian churches around New England would be there, and you could be sure that your message would be heard far and wide. The good old days of 1841. I'm being facetious, but it seems to me that if we had more people listening to each other in church instead of debating on Facebook, we would be having better and more productive conversations around some pretty serious topics. I really love the introductory here earlier today about the small groups. Those have been extremely powerful in our church over in Bellevue. The Unitarian Universalist Association's public focus has shifted quite dramatically the past few years as our churches engage the movement for Black Lives, the New Sanctuary movement, and the resistance movement that is challenging the policies and politics of the Trump administration. Amen to that. As we know from the example of social activist Theodore Parker, our churches and our associations have been active in justice movements for centuries. While some Unitarian Universalists are jumping into the renewed focus on social justice with some consequences that could only be unintentional, others are expressing frustration, anger, and alarm at accusations of racism and white supremacy inside the UUA and some of our churches. There is an article in this edition, the winter edition, and it's titled, "Do You Have to Be an Activist to Be a Unitarian Universalist?" The article interviews 6 Unitarian Universalist leaders with very diverse perspectives. I had to agree with minister and theologian Paul Racer when he commented he found it disturbing that the question had even come up. I breathed a sigh of relief because I have never considered myself a social activist during my 26 years as a Unitarian Universalist, unless it was taking a group of students to a pride parade or a Black Lives Matter event, or some other activity involved with religious education. I've done a great deal of pastoral care, religious education, conducted weddings and funerals, lots of service work in AA, and served on too many church committees to count. But social activism? Not so much. The last thing we need, Paul Racer wrote, is a form of ideological or behavioral orthodoxy where those who are not called to activism feel judged or devalued. Ideological or behavioral orthodoxy is exactly what Theodore Parker was railing against in his 1841 sermon. And people are being judged and devalued for not participating in church life in a social activist manner that does not meet the standards of others. Some of that is being called racism or white supremacy. And some of it is white supremacy and racism. But there is also one purpose of our church, one important purpose of our church, and I think it's to change the worldview of people who need their worldview altered. And that takes time, discussion, education, reflection. Prayer and meditation helps, and hopefully a renewed worldview. It's not going to happen on Facebook. Unfortunately, a great deal of the judging and devaluing is being carried out on Facebook and online with some pretty horrible accusations and defensive responses. And I'm a guilty party to some of that. When I was a seminary student at Starr King School for Ministry in Berkeley, my advisor encouraged me to take courses that would stretch me, that would make me uncomfortable. And I loved being at the Graduate Theological Union and the diversity of schools there. You could take Christian history with Episcopalians, Buddhist Christian dialogue at the Center for Buddhism, a course called The Moral Commonwealth at Starr King, or feminist theology at the Center for Women and Religion. They all excited me. I loved it. It was like a kid in a candy store. My advisor, Patty Lawrence, suggested that I take a course in gospel music with the Baptists. No, Patty, I'm not going to do that. I can't sing. And I like 1970s rock and roll music. Take the course, John. It'll be good for you. So I took a class in gospel music. And a challenging question that emerged in that class and became a semester-long discussion was whether or not well-meaning white liberals like Unitarian Universalists should be singing black gospel music in our churches. Most of the disagreement was between the younger black seminary students and some of the older black students, including the teacher. The teacher was this wonderful black woman minister in the city of Oakland. I'll never forget one of the impromptu sermons she gave about music being a gift from God, and it was intended for all of us. Not everyone agreed with her, but the dialogue was extremely rich and extremely meaningful. And it wasn't carried out on Facebook. It was a class of about 10 white white people and 10 black people, talking and singing together side by side for 4 months, deep in conversation about a very difficult topic. And it was transformative for them. I stand here before you, a privileged white cisgender male who spent many years in corporate America. The Reverend Marilyn Sewell may have been thinking of me when she wrote in the UU World article that many white UUs have become newly aware of their entitlement and the injustices wrought by racism. This awakening is all to the good. However, she also pointed out the president of the UUA, our first Hispanic president who I was in seminary with, and 3 white male leaders were accused of racism and drummed out of their positions. One of those men also happened to be a friend of mine from seminary. Online accusers, Marilyn wrote, both laity and ministers were raucous in their contempt for alternative views. They were true believers who got lost in soaring rhetoric, personal purity, and moral arrogance. It seems now virtually impossible for UUs to have an open, honest exchange about racism, at least in a public forum. I am dismayed and deeply disheartened. I am also dismayed and deeply disheartened. I might argue with Marilyn and say that I am not newly aware of my entitlement and the injustices wrought by racism, but I am painfully aware of the perception that many white UUs are not allies to people of color. And I'm not sure I buy that. I believe that most, if not all, white UUs want to be allies to people of color, but they don't want to be bullied into what Professor Razor called a form of ideological or behavioral orthodoxy. Maybe we just don't know how to get there. I don't know. I do know that after 26 years of studying and teaching the values and principles of Unitarian Universalism, I am a lot less racist, sexist, and homophobic than I was when I showed up at East Shore 26 years ago. An alcoholic from Boston, Massachusetts. Institutions shape people, and people shape institutions. And I don't think Unitarian Universalism is done with me yet. And for that, I will be forever grateful to my friends at East Shore and throughout the world of Unitarian Universalism. Amen and blessed be. Please join me in closing hymn number 1.